Let's study 9th standard ICSE Biology, Chapter 12, the skeleton. First, let's understand the functions of the human skeleton. First, it gives us support and shape. Imagine without the skeleton, you would be a shapeless blob of jelly. But more importantly, the skeleton gives us protection. For example, the cranium or the skull protects our brain. The vertebral column or the backbone protects our spinal cord. The ribs protect our heart and lungs, and so on. Next, movement. All movements or locomotion that we humans and animals do is thanks to the bones and the muscles attached to these bones. Fourth, leverage. Some bones and joints form levers of class 1, class 2 or class 3. They are simple machines which helps us to lift heavy loads at a good speed. For example, the contraction of only a few centimeters of the biceps can swing the hand swiftly. You see, the bicep is attached to this bone in your forearm. So when the biceps contract, this entire arm is pulled up. So this is the bicep here, and this is the forearm. There's a bone here. So when the biceps contract, it bulges out and it is attached to the bones. So bones move because of the contraction of muscles. And then when the triceps contract and the biceps relax, when the triceps contract, even they are attached to the bones and the arm is extended. So muscles don't expand, they only contract and relax. And these muscles having opposite action are called antagonistic muscles. The muscles are attached to the bones with the help of some tissues called tendons. It's like the sellotape which sticks the muscles to the bones. And two bones are connected to each other with the help of some tissues called ligaments. Another function of bones is the formation of blood cells, that is RBCs, WBCs. They are all born in the bone marrow. You know, the central part of long bones is actually hollow and filled with some porous tissue which forms these blood cells. And the sixth function is that the bones are a storehouse of calcium and phosphorus, which are required for the rest of the body. Now, constituents of the skeleton. It comprises of three things: bones, of course. Cartilages are also tissues, but they're not as hard as bones. And they're not porous like bones. They are also supporting and connecting structures. For example, there is a cartilage in our external ears and at the tip of the nose. That's right. The tip of your nose has a cartilage, not a bone. The hard part of your nose is a cartilage. That is why a skull, which Prince of Morocco found in the casket, had no nose. And finally, we have ligaments, which bind the bones together. So remember, ligaments bind bones together and tendons bind muscles to bones. Now let's study the structure of a bone. It consists of both organic and inorganic material. When we say organic, it means carbon-containing compounds, mostly living. Inorganic material means minerals. Minerals like calcium and phosphorus. And organic part of it are all the cells like osteoblasts and all the tissues inside it. The structure of a typical long bone is that it is highly calcified, or it has a lot of calcium. The bone cells are called osteocytes, which are similar to osteoblasts. It also has the matrix surrounding it. It has collagen fibers, and there are some concentric rings in it, which we've studied in the tissues chapter. It looks like this. The concentric rings. In the center we have the Haversian canals. That is why bones are porous. And the matrix, that is the background, is made up of salts of calcium and phosphorus. Now the external surface of the bone is covered by a membrane called periosteum. Now let's talk about the human skeleton system, which has totally 206 bones. Mostly. Some people may have a little more or a little less bones, but on average it's 206. A baby may have up to 300 bones, but as they grow, many bones fuse together. For example, the cranium has many tiny bones which fuse together as you grow older. So let's study the two main types of the skeleton: the axial skeleton along the axis and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton has the skull, the vertebral column, the ribs, whereas the appendicular skeleton has the limbs, that is hands and legs, and also the girdles. So let's talk more about it. First of all, the axial skeleton. There is a table in the textbook with the number of each bones. That is a super important table. You should start learning that table first. Once you've learned this table, it becomes very easy to learn the whole chapter. The skull has totally 29 bones. First of all, the cranium, that is a brain box, that has 8 bones. And these bones have some borders between them called sutures. Next, the face. The face has 14 bones. The strongest of them is the mandible, the lower jaw bone. Then we have the ear ossicles. In the inner ears, we have 3 tiny bones. So 3 plus 3, totally 6 ear ossicles. Out of which the stapes is the smallest bone in the human body. And finally, we have the hyoid bone, which is inside our tongue. So totally that becomes 29 bones in the entire skull. Now, hyoid bone is the only bone in the body which is not connected with any other bone. It is just connected with muscles everywhere. Next, the vertebral column, which starts from the base of the skull till the pelvis. Totally, the vertebral column has 26 bones. At the back of the cranium, there is a hole called foramen magnum. The vertebral column starts from there. The first vertebral column is called the atlas, and the second is called the axis. The atlas is fixed with the skull, and the axis is joining that. The joint between the atlas and the axis is called a pivot joint. So when you move your head left or right, it's actually the pivot joint between the axis and the atlas. That is the first and the second vertebral column. It is not a joint between the skull and the vertebral column. No, because the first vertebral column is fixed with the skull. So the bones in the neck region are called cervical vertebrae. They are 7 in number. What is surprising is that even in a giraffe's neck, there are 7 vertebrae, although they are very long. Because they are also mammals, they have exactly 7 cervical vertebrae. Below that, we have the thoracic vertebrae. That is a chest vertebrae, from which the ribs arise. The ribs, one end of the ribs are attached at the back to these thoracic vertebrae. So there are 12 such thoracic vertebrae, which makes sense because there are 12 pairs of ribs, 1 pair attached to each thoracic vertebra. Below that, we have 5 lumbar vertebrae, the lower back. Then we have 1 sacrum and 1 coccyx, which is the last tailbone. The tailbone is of no use in our body because we don't have a tail. The tailbone has some areas where the tail muscles are supposed to be attached. But in our body, the tail muscles are vestigial. It's useless, it's rudimentary. But this proves that our ancestors used to have tails. In fact, our ancestors and a monkey's ancestors were the same millions of years ago. Now, although there's just 1 sacrum and 1 coccyx, on further inspection, it seems that the sacrum is 5 vertebrae fused together and the coccyx is 4 tailbones fused together. If we were to count them separately, then instead of 26 vertebrae, we would be left with 33. And the total number of bones in a body would be 213. But officially, we count it as 1 sacrum and 1 coccyx, so we have only 26 vertebrae and 206 bones in our body. This vertebral column, if you notice, is S-shaped. It is not very straight. It acts like a spring, so that even if you jump and land on your feet, it acts like a shock absorber. Apart from protecting the spinal cord, it helps us to balance, to walk, run. Next, we have the structure of the vertebrae. As I said, the S-shaped vertebrae, this is the coccyx and the sacrum. The first one is the atlas, below which we have the axis. You can see how it perfectly fits in it to create a pivot joint. So it gives you a lot of movement, but not a 360-degree movement. And if we look at a top view of any vertebrae, typically it looks like this. This is an example of a thoracic vertebrae. It has a body, it has a rib facet, that's where the ribs are attached. It has an articular facet through which one vertebrae on top of the other gets fit. It has some transverse processes which you can feel. You can actually feel this neural spine at the back. Here you can feel it, a hard pointy thing. If you touch it with your fingers, you can feel it at the back. Now these transverse processes are the point of attachment for back muscles. Your strong back muscles are attached to this, helping you to lift heavy loads. In the center we have a cavity which is called neural canal, through which the spinal cord passes. The spinal cord is very delicate, so it has to be protected by this stack of bones around it. It is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now these 12 pairs of ribs all come in front and attach to the sternum, almost all of them. This is called the breastbone or the sternum. You can feel it in the center of your chest. You see the first 7 pairs of ribs are directly attached to the sternum, so they are called true ribs. The 8th, 9th and 10th pairs of ribs, they are not true ribs because they don't directly articulate or attach to the sternum. They attach to the 7th rib with the help of hyaline cartilage. And finally, the 11th and the 12th pair, as you can see, they are not attached to anything at this end. They're just attached to the backbone behind, but in front they are not attached at all. They are called floating ribs. They protect organs like the liver, kidney, etc. So they are also important. But some people have them removed for some reasons. Some people may even have a 13th pair of rib called the gorilla rib. So this is a better view of this rib cage which protects our organs. So this was the actual skeleton. Now let's talk about the appendicular skeleton, that is the limbs and the girdles. First let's talk about the limbs. The forelimbs, which we call as hands, have a long bone in the upper arm which is called humerus. No, it's not funny. Then we have 2 bones attached to the humerus in the lower arm which is called radius and ulna. Yes, we have 2 bones in our arms. So there are 2 bones here, radius and ulna. And what is interesting is that when we rotate our arm like this, our humerus is not moving. It's just that the radius and ulna can cross over each other very easily. And remember, the radius is always towards the thumb. Radius is towards the thumb. So for labeling, this trick will help you remember. The joint at the elbow is called a hinge joint. So more about joints shortly. Next we have the carpals, which are the wrist bones. The 8 wrist bones are there, irregularly shaped. They can glide over each other, so it's called gliding joint. Then we have the metacarpals, which are there in your palms. In your palms also there are 5 bones for the 5 fingers, so they are called metacarpals. And finally we have the phalanges in our fingers. There are totally 14 phalanges. The thumb has 2 and each of the remaining fingers have 3. So totally 14 phalanges. And this is totally 30 bones in just one hand. Similarly 30 bones in the other hand. So that's totally 60 as of now. Now let's talk about the legs, the hind limbs, which is very similar to the forelimbs. The longest bone is called the femur. It is indeed the longest bone in the entire body. Then the lower leg has 2 bones, tibia and fibula. The tibia is a front bone which is called the shin. Fibula is behind it where the calf lies. Your calf muscles are behind. Tibia is the front part, the shin bone. Then we have the ankle bones called the tarsals. Just like we had the carpals here, we have tarsals. Then we have the metatarsals, which are your feet bones. There are 5 metatarsals. And the tarsals are 7 here. We had 8 carpals and we had 7 tarsals here. Metacarpals are 5. And the phalanges are 14. Just like the phalanges of the fingers were 14. The phalanges of the toes are also 14. Yeah, the big toe has 2 phalanges and each of the small toes have 3 phalanges. Very tiny bones. And it has a kneecap. That is one special bone here, kneecap at the knee joint between the femur and the tibia fibula, which is also a hinge joint, like the hinges of a door. It gives you movement only in one direction. So totally this also is 30 plus 30, 60 bones of the leg. So 60 plus 60, 120 bones in your hands and legs. And finally, the girdles. The girdles are a part of the bone system which helps the appendicular skeleton, that is the limbs, to attach to the axial skeleton. For example, we have the shoulder girdle. The shoulder girdle has, here it has two bones. One is this clavicle, the collarbone. You can actually feel it just from your sternum. Just feel a bone passing right up till your shoulder, just below your neck. It is called the collarbone, clavicle. And behind, you can feel a shoulder blade, which is called the scapula. So two bones here and same two bones here. So total 4 bones in the shoulder girdle, also called the pectoral girdle. This scapula, the shoulder blade, which is at the back, it looks like this. And it has a cup-shaped cavity called glenoid cavity. So it provides for a ball and socket joint, something like this. Although this is the ball and socket joint of your legs, but even at your shoulder, the ball of your humerus fits into the glenoid cavity, and now it can move in all directions. It gives you a lot of freedom of movement, called the ball and socket joint. So you can see that this joint of ball and socket gives you a lot of movement compared to the hinge joint, which is only in one direction, like the hinges of a door. So now we know the 4 types of joints here: the pivot joint, the gliding joint at the wrist and the ankles, the hinge joint at the elbow and at the knee, and the ball and socket joint. Even at your hip, you can move your leg in many directions, front, back, left, right, thanks to the ball and socket joint. The ball of the femur fits into the cavity of the pelvic girdle, like this. So even at the hip, you have a ball and socket joint. And here the cavity is called acetabulum. So all these terms, biological names, have to be learned by heart. And use the diagrams to remember this. That will be the easiest way to learn it. So apart from the pectoral girdle, we have the pelvic girdle as well. The pelvic girdle, that is the hip bone. It is made up of just 2 bones. The left side is entirely 1 bone and the right side is also 1 bone. So totally 2 bones. So the pectoral girdle had totally 4 bones and the pelvic girdle has 2 bones. So that means the girdles have 6 bones, and now the total is 206 bones. And there is a difference between male and female skeletons. In females, the hips bones, the pelvis, is wide. It's wider because anatomically there is a womb inside. So there should be more space for the baby to grow in. In males, the pelvic girdle is not so broad. In fact, their shoulders are broader for more muscles. Next topic is the joints, where 2 bones meet. We may have some immovable joints. For example, as I said, the skull has some sutures which are immovable. You can't move these bones. Try it. What you can move is the skin on top of it, but not the actual bones. But when a baby is born, when the baby is coming out of the vagina, these bones are not fused yet, so they can move, which helps the big skull, the big brain of the baby to come out of the vagina. That is why you should handle a baby's brain, a baby's head, very carefully. Then we have some partially movable joints. Example, the joint between a rib. That is why when we breathe, the ribs do move a little bit. And even there is a joint between the rib and the breastbone, that is sternum. And even some of the vertebrae, the joints between the vertebrae is partially movable. So we can bend our backbone a little bit thanks to the partially movable joint there. And finally, we have freely movable joint. And freely movable joints are of 4 types, which I have explained. We have the gliding joints, which again may be there in some of the spinal vertebral column joints. You can see the vertebrae have an intervertebral disc in between, along with some hyaline cartilage. They reduce the friction when they are moving and also act like a shock absorber. Pivot joint is between the atlas and axis. These are all freely movable joints. Hinge joint, I've already given an example, like humerus and ulna, and the ball and socket joint, of course. Now, all these freely movable joints are also called synovial joints, because all these freely movable joints have something called a synovial fluid inside to reduce friction. There is a synovial membrane and a capsule to protect it. The ligament, of course, joins the muscles, the bones to the bones. There is cartilage at the tips, again to reduce friction. As you grow older, the synovial fluid starts disappearing. So that is why the friction increases and it becomes very painful. So sometimes you have to undergo a knee replacement surgery in old age. This flowchart is a good way to learn all the different types of joints. Then we've covered antagonistic muscles as well. And finally, the kinds of muscles. There are three kinds which we've already studied in tissues chapter: voluntary, involuntary, and cardiac muscles. Voluntary muscles make up around 50% of our body weight. They are under our control, like biceps and triceps. Involuntary muscles, they are not controlled by our will. They are found in the eyelids or in the diaphragm, in our intestinal walls. Cardiac muscles are also involuntary, but they are very special because they do have striations, like the voluntary muscles do. And they don't get tired. They continuously keep beating for many, many decades, unlike the voluntary muscles. Involuntary muscles are unstriated, they are smooth muscles. Hi students, this is AJ sir. If you like this video, press the like button. If you would like to enroll for my online test series or online lectures, email me or message me on Instagram. Check the description for more information.